Neolithic cultures have left various traces of their symbolism throughout southwestern Asia. Southwestern Asia is not very common. Usually we talk about the Near East, but the Near East is a very European-centered terminology because for whom is it the Near East? It's for Europeans. So that's not an unbiased way of looking at the history. So that's why I use more an objective geographical term. Or Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, Euphrates and the Tigris. The symbolism is found in many places, but it was made famous by the sites of Çatalhöyük, excavated by James Mallard nearly 60 years ago, and more recently by the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, excavated by Klaus Schmidt in the late 90s. Those two sites are about 4,000 years apart. Göbekli Tepe belongs to the very core of the Neolithic process. The other, Çatalhöyük, is located in central Anatolia, where the Neolithic diffused after its first apparition. It's interesting how in both sites they are so far apart geographically and chronologically. The same elements are to be found. Maybe it's better to start with Çatalhöyük because the iconography is very well preserved and the meaning behind the iconography was interpreted by Jean-Daniel Forest about 30 years ago. It's not very well known even among archaeologists, but his discoveries are really tremendous. In Çatalhöyük, we find this picture of female figure stretching her legs and arms towards two columns, two small pillars. Those pillars have no architectural function. They are not here to support the wall. They are part of the iconography. Figure is giving birth, and this type of elements are found everywhere on the site. Another element is the bull and the bull horns. Those are, as we saw earlier, a clear symbol of a male part of the society, but the society represents itself as male. Why? Something we have started to see earlier. The female figure is the concept. It's the concept of birthing, of fertility. And how fertility is to process, how does it work? It only works through the interaction of two exogamic social groups. We saw how the two moieties or halves or subgroups of the society are important. And by looking at this picture, we have a good idea that this Paleolithic concept went on all the way to the Neolithic. And there's no reason why it shouldn't. Agriculture will change the way people behave among themselves and the way they conceive their relation to each other. But ideology takes a lot of time to evolve. It's very conservative. It takes much more time than the apparition of a new technology and of a new mode of production, that is agriculture. So the way the people reproduce and the way they are organized to produce new generation is still going through this exogamic pattern of subgroups of the society. Here they are represented as two, but there can be many more. But they are able to conceive that plurality, whatever its number, can be brought down to the number two, because number two is the number for differentiation. The differentiation of the same thing into two equal parts. One society into two subgroups, mutually, reciprocally exchanging sexual mates at every generation. That's probably what we see here. The female figure is not a woman, it's the principle for reproduction, for fertility. How does it work? Through the interaction of those two exogamic subgroups represented by the pillar. Why the pillar? The pillar is a vertical line and it represents probably time. It's the line of ancestors going through time. This is a new way of approaching the community because this puts a lot of importance on the idea of lineage. Among earlier hunter-gatherers, people are not really able to restate their own genealogy. It can go for maybe a few generations, but after a while it gets forgotten because there's no need for it. But communities that are more based on the lineage type of society are able to remember their genealogy for tens of generations, and it's really impressive. But it shows how the genealogy from one father to his son, to his own son, to his own son, the line is very important to remember. Among later monarchies, the genealogy is very important. Here in Çatalhöyük, what we see is that the female figure is giving birth to a bull, that is, to the society. The society reproduces itself as the interaction of two exogamic halves. And well, there's one element that we don't really see here, but the female figure is also sometimes represented with her teeth. And her teeth are a symbol of death. So that completes the symbol represented here. It gives birth, and as it gives birth, it brings death. Death and life are seen as two interdependent opposites. One cannot exist without the other. Just as on the horizontal axis, one exogamic subgroup cannot exist without the other. So we have a vertical line of life and death and a horizontal line of two exogamic moieties exchanging sexual mates, so that the society can reproduce infinitely through the birthing principle represented as a female figure. The society is represented as a male figure because the reproducing principle is female. It's also part of the reciprocity among opposite principles. In Göbekli Tepe, 4,000 years earlier, we see huge circles of side pillars in a diameter of 10 meters. And right in the middle of those circles, we see two absolutely parallel, huge steles. They're called pillars usually, but since we don't know if they supported anything, we don't know if there was a roof. So I'd rather call them as stele, because even if they supported something, they had a symbolic meaning because of the way they are shaped and because of the animals that are carved in them. We see two arms going on the side, and the upper part is supposed to be the head of a human. So there's a definite anthropomorphic, that is, human-shaped steles, but they do not represent a person. It's just like the female figure in Çatalhöyük did not represent a woman. It represented a principle, and that probably the principle presented here are the two exogamic lineage and moieties, and they stand at the very center of the circle. The circle is usually a symbol for fertility. It represents the womb of a pregnant woman. And right in the middle, we have those two parallel pillars. Knowing what we know now, those two pillars cannot represent anything but the two exogamic subgroups of the society. Even if the society itself is divided into 4, 8, 12 sections, it doesn't matter. Because those people are able to conceive that the division into 12 comes down to a division in 2, because the important thing is about division. The division of a unity into absolutely equal but intrinsically interdependent subparts. That's probably what we see here in Göbekli Tepe. In Çatalhöyük, the place between the pillars was filled with the regenerative female principle. She was giving birth. Now in Göbekli, the place is completely empty, but there are reasons to think that this emptiness was filled with meaning in the eyes of the audience, and it was probably that the regenerative principle was standing there. And in initiation rituals, uh, people may have been asked to walk through the space between the pillars. If this is a regenerative principle, then this space would be understood as a threshold to life and therefore to death. When young people get initiated in traditional societies, they're supposed to die as a child and be reborn as an adult. So passing through this highly symbolic space as a threshold to death and life would make much sense. Now, about the animals carved on the faces of the pillars, they're probably very related to what Jean-Daniel Forest deciphered in Çatalhöyük. Some of them represent probably death, especially those animals of which absolutely no detail is depicted except for the teeth. And we saw that the teeth is a symbol of death. It's swallowing. And this is why also in many traditional communities there's the teeth vagina symbol. You give birth, but you destroy what you give birth to. That's the representation of life for those communities. So that's a brief introduction, but this is enough to know that those symbolic places can be read if we know how the structure of the society works, because those symbolic places are a reflection of the society, just like later religions will be through their extremely hierarchic organization. It's a reflection of the hierarchy of the society itself. I think this is enough for now for the Neolithic symbolism. Oh, one last thing. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe are immense. Some of them are 5.5 meters tall. It's humongous. Why? The message displayed, if we are right in our interpretation, is a message that was known for hundreds of thousands of years. So why now this need to display it with such majesty? Well, it's probably because Göbekli Tepe is contemporary with the first agricultural villages, even before the advent of animal domestication. So really the first agricultural settlements, and the agricultural society is structurally very different from that of the hunter-gatherers. As I said before, the importance of the pillar shows it very well. The way people conceive themselves is as part of a lineage and not anymore as part of a class which reciprocally give sexual mates with each other at every generation. It's very different. Now it's linear. At the end of the Neolithic, we have a concentration of huge villages of agriculturalists like Çatalhöyük. And this is because of the old reciprocal rule of mate exchange. One exogamic group only leaves if the two exogamic groups they exchange at every generation the sexual mates. This means that the responsible of the lineage, usually the big uncle, for example, the firstborn male of the lineage, is responsible to give the daughters and boys of his own lineage to another lineage. So that's why they don't want younger elements of the society to leave. Otherwise, the exchange of mate could not continue. So people stay at the same place. And after 1,000 years, just like in Çatalhöyük, for example, the village grows much beyond the political capacity of the village, because we are still talking about egalitarian societies. There is no hierarchy uh, in terms of political structure, at least. But the main thing is that those people are agriculturalists. All they need is a piece of land to settle on, especially because the elders of the society have a strong responsibility, but also a strong power over the younger elements of the lineage. So younger elements want to withdraw from this system because they're exploited by the elders. And the elders are supposedly in charge of finding a mate to the younger elements. But in fact, what happens is that the younger elements work and give their extra product to the elder of lineage. So to counter this exploitation, younger elements of the lineage want to withdraw and settle on a piece of land. And that's what will happen in the end. The old reciprocal mate exchange will collapse. And that's why Çatalhöyük will grow, grow, grow. And at one point, the growth will stop and it will reduce until it completely disappears. And that's when probably marital exchange rules will have changed. It will have changed with the advent of autonomous nuclear families. And that's what agriculture is all about. It's nuclear families settling on their own piece of land and making alliance with neighbors, but unrelated neighbors, for their children to mate. So the old relation of cross cousins marriage is forgotten. It has to be, because not everybody can live at the same place. And alliances are made with foreigners. The word alliance comes from here. It designates marriage, but it is an alliance between two families. This is why probably steles of Göbekli Tepe are so huge. It is because at that point the marriage system had not changed yet, and the elders of the society wanted to keep the old tradition of reciprocal mate exchange between exogamous lineages. This is what had been going on for hundreds of thousands of years, and because the elders are responsible for their entire lineage, they get a certain prestige from there. And this was very important for them. They don't want to give it up, and they want to recall to everybody the tradition of exogamic marital relationship. And this is why at the very center of circles in Göbekli Tepe, you have those two absolutely parallel pillars. Those people have no writing, but it's the element they take to convey the message, uh, stick on to exogamy. There is a certain propaganda, if we will. This is not artistic. It's a message that is conveyed probably there. Different, distinct Neolithic revolutions all happened after the advent of the Holocene. So there's clearly a relation between the two. The correlation between climatic changes and the settling down of people can be postulated with some certainty because the Holocene is not the only time it happened. At the very end of the Ice Age, climate also knew 1,000 years of warm and humid climate, the Aleröd span. And during this time, in southern Levant especially, people started settling down without agriculture. Natural resources, in particular cereals, were abundant enough for people to store them the year through to fuse the seasons in terms of natural resources. There's also a technique called the broad spectrum. This cultural period is known as the Natufian in the southern Levant, but at the very same time, the Zarzi culture in the Zagros mountains of western Iran. We have a period of settling down, really coherent with warm Alerot climate. So the Zarzi and the Natufians settled down because they could in terms of food accessibility. The direct consequence of settling down is population growth because the child mortality is reduced and because food is available. But we should not be mistaken. Climate does not produce agriculture. It is men. Men produce agriculture. The climate and the environment are here to slow down or to fasten the same process. Even if the Holocene had never happened, probably at some point agriculture would have developed, but at a much later date. What's important is the way the community evolves in its relations of production and in its mentality. The individualistic approach that happened among the latest hunter gatherers using bows and arrows, it happened during the Pleistocene. So the way the relation among individuals of the same community evolve is dependent on the environment, but it is not the core of the process. The core is the relations of production. This is the key point that we will need to follow further on.